The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council was the largest structure ever built by any living species in the known galaxy, and on this day, every seat was filled, every balcony packed, every floating platform occupied by diplomats and officials who had traveled across the stars to witness what they believed would be a simple ceremony. The chamber orbited the neutral world of Velaris Prime, a gas giant of swirling violet and gold that cast a soft glow through the transparent walls of the station. And in the center of it all stood a single podium where the newest species in the galaxy was expected to kneel and accept its place. High Arbiter Zorath Velkon stood at the head of the council's crescent-shaped table, his tall insectoid body wrapped in ceremonial robes that shimmered like oil on water, and his forearms rested calmly at his sides as he looked down at the human delegation with the quiet confidence of someone who had done this 42 times before. Young species came here eventually, and every single one of them accepted the accord of compliance, because there was no other choice, because the galaxy had been running this way for 12,000 years, and because saying no was something that simply did not happen. Ambassador Ilara Voss walked into the chamber with 3 aides behind her, and the first thing every alien in the room noticed was how small she was compared to the towering Selithari and the broad-shouldered Vorthani. But the second thing they noticed was the way she moved, slow and steady and completely unafraid, like a woman walking into her own living room. She wore a simple dark suit with no medals or ribbons, and her dark hair was pulled back from a face that gave away absolutely nothing. And when she reached the podium, she did not bow, she did not kneel. She simply stood and looked up at the High Arbiter and waited. Zorath began the ceremony with the traditional words that had been spoken for thousands of years, welcoming humanity into the fold of civilized species, praising their rapid development, and expressing the Council's generous willingness to guide them into a new era of cooperation and prosperity. The words sounded beautiful, and they were meant to, because beauty was the mask that the Council had always used to hide the chains underneath. A junior aide stepped forward and presented the Accord of Compliance on a glowing tablet, and the document was over 900 pages long, filled with elegant language and carefully worded clauses, but its meaning could be reduced to a few simple ideas. Humanity would disarm its military to a level approved by the Council. Humanity would surrender all research into artificial intelligence and hand over existing systems for review. Humanity would accept a ban on biological modification of its own species. Humanity would pay an annual tribute of rare minerals and refined elements to the Council treasury. Exchange humanity would receive limited trade routes and permission to colonize a small number of pre-approved worlds. Every species before them had read these terms, and every species before them had smiled and signed, because the alternative was isolation at best and annihilation at worst. And the Council had made sure that every young species understood this without ever having to say it out loud. Councillor Dreth Morai watched from his seat among the Vorthani delegation, his old reptilian eyes studying the human ambassador with a curiosity that bordered on unease, because something about this woman did not fit the pattern he had seen so many times before. And Dreth had learned over his long life to trust the feeling in his gut when it told him something was wrong. Ambassador Voss accepted the tablet and began to read. The chamber fell into a respectful silence as she scrolled through the pages, and minutes passed, and then more minutes, and the silence began to shift from respectful to uncomfortable as the human woman continued reading without any change in her expression. Zorath glanced at his advisors, and one of them leaned in and whispered that perhaps the human needed a translator, but Voss was reading in perfect galactic standard, and they all knew it. She read every single page, all 914 of them, and it took nearly 2 hours, and during those 2 hours, the most powerful beings in the galaxy sat and waited for a creature from a species that had only been flying between stars for 200 years. When she finally finished, she set the tablet down gently on the podium and looked up at the High Arbiter. The chamber leaned forward. Zorath spread his 4 arms in the traditional gesture of welcome and asked if humanity was prepared to join the galactic community under the terms of the Accord. Voss looked at him for a long moment, and in that silence, every translator in the room held there. Then she spoke a single word. No. The silence that followed was unlike anything the Grand Chamber had ever experienced, because it was not the silence of reverence or respect, but the silence of absolute shock. The kind of silence that falls when reality breaks in a way that nobody was prepared for. Zorath's mandibles clicked twice, a nervous habit he had not shown in public for over a century. And he asked the ambassador to repeat herself, certain that there had been some kind of error in translation or understanding. Voss repeated herself clearly and calmly, stating that the United Earth Parliament had reviewed the terms of the Accord of Compliance in full, and had determined them to be exploitative, one-sided, and incompatible with humanity's values of sovereignty and self-determination, and that humanity therefore formally and respectfully declined integration under these conditions. The chamber erupted. Dozens of species began talking at once, diplomats shouting over each other, translators struggling to keep up, and through it all, Zorath stood perfectly still with his compound eyes locked on the small human woman who had just done something that no species in 12,000 years had ever dared to do. He raised one arm, and the chamber fell silent again, and his voice was cold and sharp when he spoke, warning the ambassador that she did not seem to understand the gravity of what she was saying, that the Accord was not a negotiation, that it was the foundation of galactic order, and that refusing it would place humanity outside the protection and the patience of the Council. Voss did not flinch, and she did not raise her voice, and she said simply that humanity understood the gravity perfectly well, that they had discussed this decision for months at the highest levels of government, and that their answer was final. She thanked the Council for its time and its hospitality, wished them well, and turned, and walked out of the chamber with her 3 aides following behind her. Nobody tried to stop her, because nobody could quite believe what had just happened. Dreth Marai sat in his chair and watched her go, and the feeling in his gut had turned into something cold and heavy, because he had seen many things in his 300 years of life, but he had never seen courage like that, and courage without fear was the most dangerous thing in the universe. Within the hour, the human shuttle departed Valurus Prime and jumped to faster-than-light speeds, and the Grand Chamber descended into chaos as factions formed and accusations flew, and Zorath retreated to his private chambers with his closest advisors to decide what to do about a species that had looked at the most powerful organization in the galaxy and simply said no. That night, a young Vorthani analyst named Setha was ordered to compile a full intelligence profile on humanity, and she dove into the archives expecting to find the usual pattern of slow development and gradual expansion that every young species followed. What she found instead made her scales go pale. Humanity had been spacefaring for only 200 years, but in that time they had developed faster-than-light travel, artificial gravity, quantum computing, advanced genetic medicine, autonomous manufacturing systems, and energy generation methods that the Council had taken thousands of years to achieve. Their growth curve was not steep. It was vertical, a sharp line shooting upward with no sign of slowing down. And it did not match any known species profile in the entire galactic record. Setha checked her data 3 times, then a 4th, and then she sat back in her chair and stared at the screen. She sent her report directly to Counselor Dreth Marai, with a single note attached that read, "I think we may have made a terrible mistake." And far beyond the borders of Council space, in the quiet dark between the stars, Admiral Marcus Coles stood on the bridge of his flagship and received a two-word message from Ambassador Voss. "It's done." He nodded once and turned to his crew and told them to send a signal to every human fleet in the sector. Humanity was done asking for permission. 3 months had passed since the word "no" had echoed through the Grand Chamber. And in that time, the Galactic Council had done what it always did when a problem refused to solve itself. It had reached for the oldest weapon in its arsenal. Not guns or warships, but something far more cruel. The slow, strangling grip of economic isolation. The blockade was approved with an overwhelming majority, 40 of the 43 member species voting in favor. And within days, a wall of trade restrictions and patrol fleets had been raised around every border of human space, cutting off supply lines, freezing trade accounts, and redirecting shipping lanes so that not a single cargo vessel could reach a human colony without council approval. High Arbiter Zorath Velkon had stood before the council and declared with absolute confidence that humanity would come crawling back within 8 weeks, because no young species could survive without access to the galactic market. Isolation meant starvation of resources, collapse of infrastructure, and eventually the kind of desperation that made even the proudest civilizations beg. He had seen it happen before, not with a full blockade, but with smaller pressures applied to species that had hesitated before signing the accord. And every single time, the result was the same: submission wrapped in the language of cooperation. But 8 weeks passed, and nothing happened. Then 10 weeks, then 12, and the intelligence reports that landed on the desks of council leaders were not showing the collapse they expected, but something that made no sense at all. Human economies were growing. Spymaster Ilith Quo sat in her dark office aboard the council's intelligence station, and read the reports with her pale fingers pressed together, and her psychic mind reaching out for some thread of understanding that could explain what she was seeing. The humans had not panicked. They had not rationed. They had not sent desperate messages begging for negotiation. And instead, they had simply continued living as if the most powerful economic alliance in the galaxy had not just tried to choke them into submission. Her operatives, the best the Shaith Intelligence Bureau had ever trained, had been slipping into human space through gaps in the border patrols, disguised and equipped with the finest stealth technology the Council could produce. And the reports they sent back were deeply unsettling. They described cities that hummed with energy and purpose, factories that seemed to build themselves, farms that grew food without soil or sunlight, using systems the operatives could not even begin to understand, and shipyards where vessels of enormous size were being assembled with a speed that defied everything the Council knew about construction timelines. 3 of her best operatives had gone silent entirely, not captured and not killed, as far as she could tell, but simply vanished, as if the humans had detected them and decided they were not worth the trouble of confrontation. The ones who did return spoke in quiet voices about what they had seen, and one of them, a veteran agent named Korith, who had served the Shaith for over 60 years, had looked Ilith in the eye and told her something that kept her awake at night. He said the humans were not just surviving, they were thriving, and the worst part was that they did not seem to be doing it out of spite or defiance, but simply because they had built their civilization to be completely self-sufficient, as if they had always expected this moment and had prepared for it long before the Council ever summoned them. Meanwhile, on the border colony of New Thessaly, a young Cathari journalist named Tolan Resk was experiencing human civilization firsthand, and every day brought a new surprise that shattered another piece of what he had been taught to believe about younger species. Had won a rare press visa through a lottery that the humans had organized themselves, inviting journalists from across the galaxy to come and see their worlds with their own eyes. And he had arrived, expecting to find a civilization under siege, frightened and angry, and struggling to hold itself together. What he found instead was a small coastal city where children played in parks under an artificial sun that warmed the domed colony like a summer afternoon on his own homeworld, where markets sold fresh food and handmade goods, and music played from speakers on every corner, and where the people walked and talked and laughed, as if the word blockade meant absolutely nothing to them. He interviewed a baker, who told him she had never even thought about the council before last year, and that the blockade had not changed the price of flour by a single credit. And he interviewed a teacher, who showed him a classroom full of children learning about alien languages and cultures with genuine excitement and curiosity. And he interviewed an old man sitting on a bench by the seawall, who told him that humanity had spent its entire history being told what it could not do, and that saying no to a council of aliens was honestly one of the less dramatic examples. Tolan sent his reports back to the Kethari news networks, and they spread like fire across the galactic information grid. And for the first time, billions of alien citizens saw humanity not through the lens of council propaganda, but through the eyes of one of their own, a journalist who was clearly struggling to hide his amazement. On the border itself, Captain Raya Singh commanded the destroyer ESS Defiant on a routine patrol, when her sensors detected a council surveillance probe drifting toward a human colony, a small automated device designed to gather intelligence without being noticed. Her weapons officer asked if they should destroy it, and Singh thought about it for a moment, and then smiled, and told her communications officer to open a broadcast on every frequency the probe was using. Her message was short and direct. "You are welcome to look. We have nothing to hide." And she let the probe continue on its way, knowing that every piece of data it collected would only confirm what the Council already feared. Back on Velaris Prime, the Council held an emergency closed session, and Illith stood before the assembled leaders and delivered her assessment with the calm precision that had made her the most respected intelligence officer in the galaxy. She told them that the blockade had failed, that humanity's economic model was unlike anything in the galactic record, that they had developed closed-loop manufacturing and synthetic resource generation and self-sustaining biospheres that eliminated any dependency on external trade, and that continuing the blockade was not only pointless, but actively damaging to the Council's credibility as younger species watched and took notes. Then she said the thing that turned the emergency session into something closer to a funeral. She told them that humanity had not rejected the accord out of pride or ignorance or a failure to understand the consequences, but because they genuinely did not need anything the Council had to offer, and that the blockade had not taught humanity a lesson, but had instead taught the entire galaxy that the Council's greatest weapon was useless against a species that had already made itself free. Zorath listened with his mandibles locked tight and his compound eyes unreadable, and when Illith finished, he asked if she had anything else to report. She hesitated, which was something she never did, and then she told the Council about one final discovery. Her operatives had detected a network of installations spread across the outermost edge of human space, massive structures orbiting dead stars and hiding in the shadows of gas giants, completely powered down, and invisible to anything but the most sensitive deep-range scanners. There were thousands of them. Nobody knew what they were. Nobody knew what they did, and every attempt to get a closer look had failed because the humans had placed patrol routes around each one without ever publicly acknowledging they existed. The council chamber was very quiet when Illith finished speaking. Dreth Morai, the old Vorthani counselor who had watched Ambassador Voss walk out of this very chamber 3 months ago, stood slowly and addressed the room. He said that he had studied many species in his long life, and that the most dangerous ones were never the ones who threatened you, but the ones who simply did not care whether you existed. Because a species that needed you could be controlled, and a species that feared you could be predicted, but a species that had looked at everything you had to offer and walked away without a second thought was something else entirely. Said they were not dealing with a young species that had gotten lucky. They were dealing with something the galaxy had never encountered before, and if the council did not change its approach very quickly, the word no was going to be the least of their problems. Zorath dismissed the session without responding, and as the councilors filed out in silence, Illith remained in her seat and stared at the holographic map of human space that still floated above the table. Those thousands of dark installations glowed faintly on the display like sleeping eyes, and somewhere in the back of her ancient psychic mind, a voice whispered a warning she could not quite put into words. Something was coming, and the council was not ready for it. 6 months after humanity had refused the Accord of Compliance, the Galactic Council decided to stop talking and start showing its teeth. Because if economics could not break the humans, then perhaps the sight of 400 warships would remind them of their place in the natural order of things. Fleet Commander Vorix Jean was chosen to lead the demonstration fleet, and he was everything the Council wanted in a military leader. Decorated, experienced, loyal, and Selithari to his core, which meant he believed in the rightness of the Council the way most species believed in gravity, as something so fundamental it did not require proof. He assembled his armada at the staging point of Kethrin Drift, 400 warships drawn from a dozen species, each one painted in the silver and blue of the Council's unified command, bristling with plasma batteries and kinetic launchers and shield generators that represented the peak of 12,000 years of galactic military engineering. His orders were simple. Jump to the border system of Acheron's Gate. Take up an aggressive formation within visual range of human sensor stations, and wait for the humans to come to the table with something other than the word no on their lips. It was not supposed to be a battle. It was supposed to be a message, and the message was that the Council had been patient long enough. Vorix briefed his captains aboard his flagship, the Spear of Selioth, and he told them to expect a token human defense force, perhaps a few dozen ships at most, because intelligence suggested that humanity's main fleets were spread thin across their territory, and could not concentrate quickly enough to respond to a surprise deployment. He told them to hold formation, look intimidating, and let the silence do the work, because 400 warships hanging in the dark was the kind of argument that did not need words. They jumped to Acheron's Gate on a bright morning by Council Standard Time, and the fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel in perfect formation, a crescent of warships stretching across thousands of kilometers of empty space, sensors sweeping the system with the confidence of a predator entering its hunting ground. And they found nothing. The system was empty, completely and impossibly empty. No human ships, no defense platforms, no orbital stations, no mines, no automated weapons, nothing but the cold light of a distant star and the slow tumble of a few barren asteroids. Vorix's tactical officer reported the scan results 3 times because he could not believe what he was seeing, and each time the answer was the same. The system was deserted. A murmur ran through the fleet, not of relief, but of unease, because an empty battlefield was not a gift, it was a question. And the question was, where are they? Vorix ordered his ships to hold position and expand their sensor range to maximum. Minutes, the most powerful military fleet in the galaxy, sat in the dark, and waited and listened to the silence. Then something appeared on sensors. It was a single contact, dropping out of faster-than-light travel directly ahead of the formation, at a distance so close that every proximity alarm on every ship screamed at once. And when the visual feeds resolved and the image appeared on 400 command screens, Vorix felt something he had not felt in 6 wars across 3 centuries. He felt small. The ship was enormous, nearly 3 kilometers from bow to stern, a sleek and terrible thing that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of dark metal. And it radiated energy signatures so powerful that half the sensors in the fleet overloaded and went blind the moment they tried to get a reading. It was the ESS Avalon, and it had come alone. Vorix stared at the image, and his mandibles clicked once in the silence of his bridge, and his tactical officer turned to him with wide eyes and said that the energy output of that single vessel exceeded the combined output of their entire fleet by a factor they could not calculate, because their instruments were not designed to measure numbers that large. A communication channel opened, and the face of Ambassador Elara Voss appeared on screen, and she was sitting in what appeared to be a comfortable chair aboard the Avalon, with a cup of something warm in her hands, and her expression was the same as it had been in the Grand Chamber 6 months ago, calm, patient, and completely unreadable. She greeted Fleet Commander Vorix by name and rank, and told him that humanity recognized the Council's right to conduct military exercises in neutral space. And she said that she was here as a courtesy to advise him that the Acheron's gate system was now under human territorial protection, and that his fleet was welcome to withdraw at its convenience. Her tone was not threatening, not angry. It was the tone of someone giving directions to a lost traveler, and that was somehow worse than any threat could have been. Vorix felt the weight of his orders pressing down on him, and he felt the pride of his species burning in his chest. And he opened a channel to the Avalon, and told the ambassador that the Council fleet would not withdraw, that it had been authorized to remain in this system as a lawful demonstration of Council authority, and that he strongly advised the humans to reconsider their position. Voss looked at him for a moment, and something moved behind her eyes that might have been sadness, and she said, "I understand, Commander, and I am sorry for what comes next." The channel closed. What happened in the following 11 seconds would be studied by military academies across the galaxy for centuries to come, and it would be discussed in hushed voices by officers who could not quite believe that such a thing was possible. Avalon activated a weapon system that the Council had no name for, no classification for, and no defense against. It did not fire beams of energy or launch projectiles or release any kind of weapon that the galaxy had ever seen. Instead, it reached out with invisible hands and twisted the fabric of space itself. Across the entire formation, micro-singularities bloomed like dark flowers, each one lasting less than a second, but each one perfectly placed to do exactly what it was designed to do. Shields collapsed as gravity wells pulled them inside out. Engines died as their fuel systems were disrupted at the molecular level. Weapons went dark as power conduits were pinched shut by forces that should not have existed outside of a black hole. In 11 seconds, 400 warships went from the most powerful military force in the galaxy to 400 drifting pieces of metal floating dead in the void. Not a single ship was destroyed. Not a single crew member was killed. Not a single hull was breached. The fleet was alive, intact, and completely powerless, disabled with a precision so perfect that it could only have been achieved by a species that understood the fundamental forces of the universe in a way the Council had never imagined possible. Vorix sat in his command chair in the dark, surrounded by the soft sounds of emergency systems and the quiet breathing of his bridge crew, and he stared at the blank screen where the Avalon's image had been, and tried to process what had just happened to his fleet. The communication system flickered back to life on a low-power emergency frequency, and Voss's voice came through the speakers one more time. She told him that his crews were unharmed, and that rescue shuttles were welcome to enter the system freely, and she told him that humanity would not fire on unarmed vessels, and that his people would be given all the time they needed to restore their ships, to please convey a message to the High Arbiter, that humanity's position had not changed, and that they wished to be left alone. Then the Avalon turned and vanished into faster-than-light travel, as silently as it had arrived, and the fleet of 400 warships was left drifting in the starlight like leaves on still water. It took 6 hours for the first Council rescue ships to arrive, and by then every officer in the fleet had had time to sit in the silence and think about what had happened, and every single one of them had reached the same conclusion, that they had been spared not because the humans were weak, but because the humans had chosen mercy, and that the gap between what the Avalon could have done and what it chose to do was the most terrifying thing any of them had ever encountered. When the report reached Velaris Prime, the council chamber erupted into the worst crisis in living memory, with factions screaming at each other, and Zorath standing rigid at his podium as the reality of the situation crashed down on him like a wave. Dreth Morai stood in the chaos and waited until the shouting died down, and then he said the words that would be quoted in history books for generations. They could have destroyed the fleet, and they chose not to. And that should terrify you more than if they had, because a species that can kill you and decides not to is a species that is making a choice. And the only thing standing between us and destruction is their willingness to keep making that choice. The chamber went quiet, and somewhere deep in the bowels of a human research station called Prometheus Ascending, Dr. Lena Harker contacted Admiral Cole on a secure channel, and told him that the gravity lensing array had performed within expected parameters, and that the Avalon's secondary weapon system was fully operational. Cole asked about the primary system. Harker paused for a long time before answering, and when she spoke, her voice was very quiet. "It is not ready yet, sir, and honestly I hope it never has to be." Cole closed the channel, and stood alone on his bridge, and looked out at the stars, and he thought about the fact that humanity had just disabled the most powerful fleet in the galaxy with a system they considered secondary. And he wondered what it said about his species, that their greatest fear was not losing a war, but winning one too completely. 9 months after humanity had said no to the Galactic Council, the galaxy was no longer asking whether the Council would punish the humans, but whether the Council would survive the humans. And the answer to that question was changing every single day. The humiliation at Acheron's Gate had done more damage to the Council than any war in its 12,000-year history. Not because ships had been lost, but because something far more important had been shattered. The belief that the Council was the strongest force in the galaxy. The idea that its authority was backed by power that no one could challenge. The assumption that the natural order would always hold. That belief had been the foundation of everything, and now it had a crack running through it, and cracks had a way of spreading. 3 species formally petitioned to renegotiate their terms under the Accord of Compliance within the first week after the battle, citing changed circumstances and requesting reviews of their military and economic restrictions, and Zorath denied all 3 petitions without even reading them, because admitting that the accord could be questioned was the same as admitting that it could be broken. But the questions kept coming, not in formal petitions anymore, but in whispered conversations between diplomats in hallways, in encrypted messages between colonial governors, in the quiet refusal of certain species to volunteer ships for council patrol rotations, and in the growing audience for a Kethari journalist named Tolan Resk, whose reports from inside human space had become the most watched broadcasts in galactic history. Tolan had spent months living among the humans, and his reports painted a picture that the Council could not compete with, because it was a picture of ordinary people living ordinary lives in extraordinary freedom, of children who were never told there were things they were not allowed to learn, of scientists who pursued knowledge without asking permission from a distant authority, of communities that govern themselves through debate and consensus, rather than obedience. The reports were not propaganda. They were simply the truth, and the truth was more dangerous than any weapon the Avalon carried. It was in this atmosphere of fracture and doubt that humanity made its first proactive move, and it was not a military move, but something far more clever. Ambassador Voss began appearing in neutral systems, not Council territory and not human space, but the unclaimed zones between them. And she came not with warships, but with trade delegations, and technology specialists, and cultural ambassadors. And she carried with her an offer that was so simple, It was almost embarrassing compared to the 900 pages of the Accord. Humanity offered bilateral agreements, one species at a time, face to face, equal to equal, with terms that could be written on a single page. Trade access with no tribute. Payments, technology exchange programs with no restrictions on what could be learned. Mutual defense agreements that asked for nothing more than the promise that neither side would attack the other. And a single founding principle that every agreement was built on, that no species had the right to tell another species how to live. They called it the Open Compact, and it spread like light through a dark room. 5 species signed within the first month, small nations on the edges of council space, who had lived under the Accord for centuries, and had never dared to imagine an alternative. And when the council did not destroy them for signing, 5 more joined, and then 10 more, and then the floodgates opened. Senator Mira Okafor stood before Earth's parliament and watched the numbers climb on the display board behind her. 20 species now part of the Open Compact, each one a crack in the wall of the council's authority, and she felt both pride and worry in equal measure, because she knew that a cornered predator was the most dangerous kind. Zorath was losing control, and everyone could see it, and the fury that burned behind his compound eyes was becoming harder to hide with each passing day. He declared the Open Compact an act of economic warfare against the Council, and threatened military reprisals against any species that joined. But the Council fleet was still limping back from Acheron's Gate, many ships still undergoing repairs from the gravity distortions that had torn through their systems, and everyone in the galaxy knew that the threat was hollow. The real earthquake came when Dreth Morai stood before the full council and announced that the Vorthani Collective was withdrawing from the Accord of Compliance and applying to join the Open Compact. The chamber fell into a silence so deep it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, because the Vorthani were not some minor border species. They were one of the 5 founding members of the Council. They had been part of the Alliance since the very beginning, and Dreth Morai had served on the Council for over 300 years. Zorath demanded to know if this was a joke or a betrayal, and Dreth looked at him with those ancient reptilian eyes and said it was neither, that it was simply a choice, the same kind of choice that every species deserved the right to make. He said that the Vorthani had believed in the Council's mission for 12,000 years, but that the mission had changed somewhere along the way from cooperation to control, and that he could no longer pretend otherwise. He walked out of the chamber the same way Voss had walked out 9 months earlier, slowly and calmly and without looking back. And the political earthquake his departure triggered was felt on every world in the galaxy. In a quiet corner of neutral space, Cathari Fleet Admiral Keth Voron sat across from Captain Raya Singh in a small meeting room, aboard a human station, and tried to put into words something he had carried inside him for his entire life. He told her that his people, the Cathari, had lived under the Accord for 9,000 years, and that 3 generations ago the Council had forced them to abandon their research into artificial intelligence, research that had been the pride of Cathari science, and that the knowledge had been confiscated and locked away in council vaults where it would never be seen again. He told her that his grandparents had wept when the labs were shut down, and that his parents had grown up in a world where certain questions were simply not allowed to be asked, and that he had spent his entire career in the council fleet telling himself that this was the price of order and stability. And then he asked her the question that had been burning in his chest since the day he watched the broadcast from Acheron's Gate. Is your offer real? Can we truly be free? Looked at him for a long moment, and she thought about all the ways she could answer, all the diplomatic phrases and careful promises she could make, and instead she said something simple. We were never the ones holding the chains. Voron closed his eyes and breathed, and when he opened them again, Singh could see that something had changed in the old admiral. Something that had been locked away for a very long time had finally been set free. Back on Valurus Prime, Zorath did the one thing that Dreth Morai and Illith and every moderate voice on the council had been praying he would not do. He activated the Hegemony Protocol. It was an ancient law buried deep in the council's founding charter that allowed the High Arbiter to conscript ships from every member species for a unified military campaign in times of existential threat, and it had not been invoked in over 4,000 years. And the last time it had been used, it had ended in the destruction of an army. Entire star system. Zorath stood before the council and declared that humanity represented an existential threat to galactic civilization, and that under the authority of the Hegemony Protocol, he was ordering the assembly of the largest armada in galactic history, a fleet that would carry the full weight of council authority to the Sol system and end this crisis once and for all. The vote was closer than anyone expected, 24 in favor and 16 against, with 3 abstentions. And the species that voted no did so knowing they would face consequences. But they voted no anyway, because the wind was changing and they could feel it. Senator Okafor addressed Earth's Parliament in a closed emergency session, and her voice was steady, but her eyes were grave, as she told them that Zorath had chosen the path of war, that an armada of unprecedented size would soon be heading for Earth, and that while humanity had the power to defend itself, the decisions they made in the coming weeks would determine not just whether they survived, but what kind of species they would be on the other side. Parliament voted unanimously to authorize Admiral Cole to activate the installations at the edge of human space, the thousands of dark structures that had been sleeping in the void since before the Council ever knew humanity existed. That night, across the entire rim of human territory, the installations powered on. It happened all at once, thousands of structures lighting up simultaneously like a string of stars being switched on. And the energy surge was so massive that sensors on worlds halfway across the galaxy detected it, a pulse of power that rippled through space like a heartbeat. On Valurus Prime, Spymaster Illith Kyo was working late in her office when the alert came through, and she pulled up the sensor data and watched the map of human space transform before her eyes, as point after point of light appeared along its borders. Spent her entire career analyzing threats and calculating risks, and in all her centuries of service, she had never felt what she felt now as she stared at that map. It was not anger, it was not frustration, it was not even the cold professional concern that had carried her through so many crises before. It was fear, pure and genuine and deep, the kind of fear that told her with absolute certainty that the galaxy was about to change forever, and that there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. 12 months to the day since Ambassador Elara Voss had spoken a single word and changed the course of galactic history. The largest armada ever assembled in the known universe crossed the border into human space and began its march toward the one world that Zorath believed would end this once and for all, Earth. The fleet was staggering in its size, over 6,000 warships drawn from dozens of species under the Hegemony Protocol, a river of metal and fire stretching across light years, and at its head flew the flagship Throne of Ages, with High Arbiter Zorath Velkan standing on its bridge, with his 4 arms clasped behind his back, and his compound eyes fixed on the stars ahead. Fleet Commander Vorik San stood beside him as tactical advisor, and he had not wanted this assignment, had not wanted to be anywhere near this campaign, because he had seen what a single human ship could do, and the memory still visited him in his sleep. But Zorath had demanded his presence, and a Selithari did not refuse the High Arbiter. They pushed deeper into human space, and every system they entered was empty. No defense fleets, no orbital platforms, no minefields, no ambushes, nothing but quiet stars and silent worlds. And with each empty system, the unease in the fleet grew heavier, like water rising in a room with no doors. Vorix watched the sensor displays, and felt the wrongness of it crawling under his chitin, because empty space was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign that the humans wanted them to come, and anything that an enemy wanted you to do was something you should not be doing. He told Zorath that the absence of resistance was itself a message, that the humans were drawing them in, that every light year they traveled was another light year between them and any hope of retreat, and that the smart move was to stop and reconsider before they reached Sol. Zorath turned those unreadable compound eyes on him and said that the Council had been reconsidering for 12 months, and that reconsidering was what had brought them to this point, and that today was the day the galaxy would remember who held the power. Voryx said nothing more, because there was nothing left to say to a leader who had mistaken stubbornness for strength. They arrived at the Sol system on a day when Earth was turning its blue face toward the fleet, and the sight of it stopped conversations on bridges across the Armada, because it was beautiful in a way that none of them had expected, a small bright jewel of ocean and cloud hanging in the dark. And it looked fragile, and it looked undefended, and it looked like the easiest victory in military history. For exactly 30 seconds, the fleet held position, and the galaxy held its breath. Then Admiral Marcus Cole opened a communication channel, but not just to the Armada, to every receiver in the galaxy, every ship and station and colony and homeworld. Public broadcast system, every antenna and dish and relay point in the entire network of civilized space. His voice reached billions of ears at the same moment, carried on a signal so powerful and so precisely calibrated that not a single world was left out. And as he began to speak, the Aegis network activated. The thousands of installations that had been sleeping at the edges of human space and throughout the territories of every Open Compact member came fully online, and what they created was not a weapon, but a shield. A lattice of interlocking energy barriers that sprang to life across millions of cubic light-years, connecting to each other in a web so vast and so intricate that it defied comprehension. The barriers shimmered into existence like walls of golden light, enclosing human space and every Open Compact system in an impenetrable defensive network that sensors across the Armada could not find a frequency to penetrate, could not find a weakness to exploit, could not find a way through, or around, or under. The Armada was inside the barrier, surrounded by it, and completely at its mercy, and yet not a single weapon was pointed at them. Cole spoke, and his words were simple, because the truth did not need decoration. To the people of the Galactic Council, not your leaders, but your people, we are not your enemy, and we never were, and we never wanted to be. We rejected the Accord because we believe that no species should have to kneel before another to earn the right to exist. And we built the Aegis not to conquer, but to protect ourselves and anyone who stands with us, and anyone who asks for shelter. The age of empires held together by fear is over, not because we have destroyed it, but because we are offering something better. And the choice of whether to accept that offer belongs to you, not to the leaders who sent this fleet. Any species that wishes to stand as equals is welcome at our side. Any species that wishes to be left alone will be left alone, and we asked nothing in return except the same courtesy. This is not a threat, this is a promise, and it is the only kind of promise worth making, one that costs us something to keep. The broadcast ended, and silence fell across the galaxy like snow. On 6,000 warships, crews stood at their stations and listened to the echo of those words, and on every bridge, and every gun deck, and every engine room, beings of dozens of species looked at each other and asked themselves a question that the Council had never allowed them to ask. What if things could be different? Zorath broke the silence on his own bridge with an order that rang sharp and cold through the air. All ships to attack formation, all weapons to maximum yield, all captains to fire on his command. The order traveled across the fleet at the speed of light, and one by one, the responses came back. Refuse was a Kethari cruiser, its captain broadcasting on an open channel that she would not fire on a civilization that had just offered her people their freedom. The second was a Vorthani destroyer whose crew had voted unanimously to power down their weapons. The third was a Selithari frigate, one of Zorath's own species, and when the captain reported that his crew had locked him out of the weapon systems, the silence on the throne of ages became absolute. Ship after ship after ship refused the order, some quietly powering down their systems, some broadcasting their refusal for the galaxy to hear, some simply going dark and drifting, and within an hour, the largest armada in history had become the largest act of peaceful disobedience the galaxy had ever witnessed. Vorik-Zan turned to the High Arbiter and told him in a voice that carried no anger and no triumph, but only the heavy weight of duty, that he was relieving him of command under Article 7 of the Council Military Code on grounds of judgment impairment, and that the fleet would stand down immediately. Zorath looked at his old commander with something that might have been fury or might have been grief, and then the fight went out of him, all at once, like air from a punctured hull, and he sat down in his command chair and said nothing. The Galactic Council as a political body effectively ceased to exist in the hours that followed, not with a final vote or a formal declaration, but with a silence that spread from ship to ship and world to world, as species after species withdrew their membership and chose their own path for the first time in thousands of years. Some joined the Open Compact immediately. Some declared independence and asked only to be left in peace, and some simply needed time to remember what it felt like to make their own decisions after so many centuries of being told what to do. In the days that followed, the Aegis barriers remained active, opened corridors for any ship that wished to pass through peacefully, and the galaxy began the slow and messy and beautiful work of rebuilding itself on a foundation of choice rather than fear. On the observation deck of the Avalon, Ambassador Ilera Voss stood at the window and watched the former Council Armada drift in the gentle light of Earth's sun. 6,000 ships sitting peacefully in the void like a flock of birds resting on still water. Dreth Morai found her there, the old Vorthani walking slowly, with the careful steps of someone who had carried a heavy burden for a very long time and had only just set it down. He stood beside her and watched the ships and the earth and the stars, and after a while he asked her a question that had been forming in his mind since the very first day he saw her walk out of the Grand Chamber. He asked why humanity had built all of this, the ships and the Aegis and the technology and the alliances, if they had never intended to conquer, if they had never wanted an empire, if they had been willing from the very beginning to simply be left alone. Voss was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. She told him that where humanity came from, the ones with the most power had almost always been the ones who used it worst, that their history was full of empires that had risen on the backs of the powerless, and fallen when the weight of their own cruelty became too much to bear, and that humanity had decided a long time ago to be different, not because they were better than anyone else, but because they had learned the hard way what happened when you chose not to be. Dreth thought about this for a long time, and the silence between them was comfortable in the way that silence can only be between two people who have come through something difficult and found understanding on the other side. Then he said that he thought the galaxy had much to learn from her species. Voss smiled, a real smile, the first one he had ever seen from her, and she said that humanity had a lot to learn from his species too, and that this was rather the point. 1 year later, the Open Compact had grown to include 38 species, and the Selithari hives had fractured into independent clans, but were slowly and cautiously negotiating entry on their own terms. And Zorath lived in quiet exile on a world that nobody remembered the name of. Tolan Resk published his book, The Species That Said No, and it became the most widely read text in galactic history, translated into every known language and read by billions of beings, who found in its pages not just the story of humanity, but the story of what freedom could look like when someone was brave enough to offer it. Admiral Cole retired to a small house by the sea on Earth, and spent his days reading and walking on the beach, and trying not to think about the primary weapon system that Dr. Welts Parker had built and that had never needed to be used. And at the edges of known space, the Aegis network hummed quietly in the dark. A web of light stretched across the stars. Not a wall to keep anyone out, but a promise to keep everyone safe. A promise that said you are not alone, you do not have to kneel, and the stars belong to all of us.